Where's the line between criticism, fair comment, analysis, and examination, and moral panic, censure, and censorship? I think it can be most easily and succinctly be put as criticism, actual criticism, is anything that can be just dismissed with,
"Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man."
while moral panic and censorship can be characterized more in the way of "ban this sick filth." Okay, so we've got criticism.
"Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man."
And we have moral panic. "Ban this sick filth." But what are the really big differences between the two before we get lost in the weeds of some complications and so on? Well, criticism is opinion. It might be based on a particular lens or form of analysis, but when it boils down to it, it's really just an opinion that might be backed by some facts or might not. If you look at a piece of art, I don't like the way in which the brush strokes create such and such an effect. That's criticism. You're not calling for the painting to be banned or anything. In order to be a moral panic, it has to make some kind of reality claim, and that reality claim has to have some kind of moral impact. It has to deprave or derange or whatever. We're familiar with this in the past from instances like horror comics, which were said to be making kids of the time into delinquents. Or we can look at rock and roll or punk music, or we can look at heavy metal and its supposed links with Satanism, or D&D and its supposed links with Satanism, or vampires supposedly inspiring blood-drinking vampire murders, I believe in Florida, if I'm remembering correctly. We're familiar with all of these, and more recently, though some people don't seem to understand it, in this context you can look at Jack Thompson, but in the same kind of arena you can look at people like Anita Sarkeesian. It's just, they're not saying that games cause violence anymore, they're saying that they perpetuate misogyny or whatever else. What brings that into the arena of moral panic is the attempt to enact censorship, to change the way media is approached, to use force of various kinds to try and get creators to change what they're doing. But we're well used to listening to that side of things, so I'm going to use an example from the other side, because there are right-wing moral panics. So, when you hear someone like Dave Cullen going on and on about cultural Marxism,
Oops, sorry about that.
well, then they're engaged in a moral panic as well, because cultural Marxism isn't a conspiracy. Unfortunately, the left has started to call it a conspiracy theory when it is a real thing. It's cultural criticism through a Marxist lens, so it's suggesting that culture is also a mechanism by which people can be oppressed, not just economics. But that's all it is. It's a way of looking at the world like that. It's not a conspiracy of people trying to use culture in order to change people's opinions. In fact, it's people railing against that. It's sometimes used as a justification for moral panic and censorship arguments, in which case it does become a moral panic. But Dave himself and others, in blowing this out of all proportion and pretending as though there is this big conspiracy going on to pervert the minds of the youth with transgender issues or transgender bathrooms or whatever else, these are moral attempts to change things. It's attempts to impose their morals on others. People do it in both directions. It's an aspect of a disgust reflex, which is much more common in conservatives, but then I would argue that these kind of moral arbiters, whether they call themselves left or right or whatever, I would argue that they are small c conservatives, and that they are driven very much by their outrage and disgust. So that's less a marker of a particular political wing anymore, and more to do with the authoritarian, libertarian approach, wanting to control others, wanting to control and set the moral tone of the world. That is very much a conservative, authoritarian, small c conservative, authoritarian thing, whereas do your thing, let it all hang out, that's much more of a libertine and libertarian perspective, which is the one that I have. Alright, but it's never really quite that easy, is it? We have these nice categories, but there are always edge cases. So what are movements like Gamergate, like Comicsgate, and so on? Because on the one hand, they are very much fighting to preserve the creators' right to free expression, to make whatever they want without being censored and controlled by these new moral busybodies and their moral panics about misogyny, sexism, whatever, rape culture, whatever else it might be. But often there's elements within that from these right-wing moral panics that come into things, and they don't want any games to explore these issues of sexuality, of feminism, whatever else. Now, they might very much be the minority in groups like Gamergate or Comicsgate, but they do tend to be used to colour the entire movement, and this is extremely unfortunate. So there are people engaged in these groups who are fighting to preserve what they like, which is the good part, but also to prevent things that they don't like being created, which is making the same mistake as the people that they are initially fighting against. So there are issues, but by and large I find, in my experience, that these resistance movements, for want of a better term, tend to be far more accepting and forgiving and understanding. And you can take Steven Universe as an example. Steven Universe is a very right-on man. It's a very right-on cartoon for today's pseudo-progressive issues of gender, sexuality, representation, tokenism, if you want to call it that, all the rest of it. It very much ticks all those boxes. But it hasn't attracted the same kind of storm of outrage as, say, the new She-Ra cartoon has, or other examples like that terrible Thundercats thing that was being bandied around. It hasn't attracted that same kind of furore and resistance as these other things, and it's worth examining why that is. Well, I think the overwhelming majority of people in this cultural backlash, it's not really reactionary, because it's not conservative by and large, but most of those people are perfectly happy for others to make things that they like. They just don't like their shit being fucked with. That's the difference. If you want to go off and make something, they'll make fun of it, they'll pour scorn on it, but they're perfectly happy for you to make it. They don't like you messing with things that they love and trying to make them more right on. That really pisses them off. And that's the kind of edge case you can talk about. But if you go off and make something yourself, something new, you might be made fun of, but that's about as far as it goes. They don't call for it to be banned or changed or whatever else. They just laugh at it. And that's not really so bad. But in the reverse situation, if you come out with a game or a comic or whatever that espouses non-PC values, or doesn't even espouse them, just embodies them, you're going to get calls for being banned, censored, changed, fired, all the rest of it. And that's the fundamental difference. There are always exceptions, but when we're looking at the overall demography of the two groups and the overall behaviour and character, the group psychology, that's the difference. One's largely willing to live and let live, though it might poke fun at you. And the other side wants to censor and control and change everything according to their moral whims. And they will try and find some pseudo-scientific justification for it, but ultimately it's a conservative, authoritarian moral judgment. And that's why we have all these conflicts. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy inside Gamergate.
I didn't wanna hurt you, baby, I didn't wanna hurt you. I didn't wanna hurt you, but you're pretty when you cry.
This is horrible what happened today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity.